with the extension of area under cultivation because of increasing population, extension of irrigation facilities, acquiring the pastures for government purposes, for example, defense, industries and agricultural experimental farms. Now, breeders find it difficult to raise large herds. Thus their earnings have gone down. The quality of their livestock has deteriorated, dietary standards have fallen and indebtedness has increased. The Report of the Royal Commission of Agriculture in India, 1928. Source E. Pastoral communities elsewhere in Africa faced similar problems. In Namibia, in southwest Africa, the Kaukholand herders traditionally moved between Kaukholand and nearby Ovamboland, and they sold skin, meat and other trade products in neighboring markets. All this was stopped with the new system of territorial boundaries that restricted movements between regions. The nomadic cattle herders of Kaukholand and Namibia complained, "We have difficulty. We cry. We are imprisoned. We do not know why we are locked up. We are in jail. We have no place to live, we cannot get meat from the south, our sleeping skins cannot be sent out, Ovamboland is closed for us. We lived in Ovamboland for a long time. We want to take our cattle there, also our sheep and goats. The borders are closed. The borders press us heavily. We cannot live." Statement of Kaukholand herders, Namibia, 1949. Quoted in Michael Bollig, The Colonial Encapsulation of the Northwestern Namibian Pastoral Economy, Africa 68, 4, 1998. Source F. In most places in colonial Africa, the police were given instructions to keep a watch on the movements of pastoralists, and prevent them from entering white areas. The following is one such instruction given by a magistrate to the police, in southwest Africa, restricting the movements of the pastoralists of Kaukholand and Namibia. Passes to enter the territory should not be given to these natives unless exceptional circumstances necessitate their entering. The object of the above proclamation is to restrict the number of natives entering the territory and to keep a check on them, and ordinary visiting passes should therefore never be issued to them. Kaukaveld permits to enter, magistrate to police station commanders of Outyo and Kamanjab, the 24th of November 1937. On Tanganyika. Britain conquered what had been German East Africa during the First World War. In 1919 Tanganyika came under British control. It attained independence in 1961 and united with Zanzibar to form Tanzania in 1964. Chapter 6. Peasants and Farmers. In the previous two chapters you read about pastures and forests, and about those who depended on these resources. You learnt about shifting cultivators, pastoral groups and tribals. You saw how access to forests and pastures was regulated by modern governments, and how these restrictions and controls affected the lives of those who used these resources. In this chapter you will read about peasants and farmers, with a special focus on 3 different countries. You will find out about the small cottagers in England, the wheat farmers of the USA, and the opium producers of Bengal. You will see what happens to different rural groups with the coming of modern agriculture, what happens when different regions of the world are integrated with the capitalist world market. By comparing the histories of different places you will see how these histories are different, even though some of the processes are similar. Let us begin our journey with England, where the agricultural revolution first occurred. 1. The coming of modern agriculture in England. On the 1st of June 1830, a farmer in the northwest of England found his barn and haystack reduced to ashes by a fire that started at night. In the months that followed, cases of such fire were reported from numerous districts. At times only the rick was burnt, at other times the entire farmhouse. Then on the night of the 28th of August 1830, a threshing machine of a farmer was destroyed by labourers in East Kent in England. In the subsequent 2 years, riots spread over southern England and about 387 threshing machines were broken. Through this period, farmers received threatening letters urging them to stop using machines that deprived workmen of their livelihood. Most of these letters were signed in the name of Captain Swing. Alarmed landlords feared attacks by armed bands at night, and many destroyed their own machines. Government action was severe. Those suspected of rioting were rounded up. 976 prisoners were tried, 9 men were hanged, 505 transported, over 450 of them to Australia, and 644 put behind bars. Captain Swing was a mythic name used in these letters. But who were the Swing rioters? Why did they break threshing machines? What were they protesting against? To answer these questions, we need to trace the developments in English agriculture in the 18th and 19th centuries. 1.1 The time of open fields and commons. Over the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the English countryside changed dramatically. Before this time, in large parts of England, the countryside was open. It was not partitioned into enclosed lands privately owned by landlords. Peasants cultivated on strips of land around the village they lived in. At the beginning of each year, at a public meeting, each villager was allocated a number of strips to cultivate. Usually, these strips were of varying quality and often located in different places, not next to each other. The effort was to ensure that everyone had a mix of good and bad land. Beyond these strips of cultivation lay the common land. All villagers had access to the commons. Here they pastured their cows and grazed their sheep, collected fuelwood for fire and berries and fruit for food. They fished in the rivers and ponds, and hunted rabbit in common forests. For the poor, the common land was essential for survival. It supplemented their meager income, sustained their cattle, and helped them tide over bad times when crops failed. In some parts of England, this economy of open fields and common lands had started changing from about the 16th century. When the price of wool went up in the world market in the 16th century, rich farmers wanted to expand wool production to earn profits. They were eager to improve their sheep breeds and ensure good feed for them. They were keen on controlling large areas of land in compact blocks to allow improved breeding. So they began dividing and enclosing common land and building hedges around their holdings to separate their property from that of others. They drove out villagers who had small cottages on the commons, and they prevented the poor from entering the enclosed fields. Till the middle of the 18th century, the enclosure movement proceeded very slowly. The early enclosures were usually created by individual landlords. They were not supported by the state or the church. After the mid-18th century, however, the enclosure movement swept through the countryside, changing the English landscape forever. Between 1750 and 1850, 6 million acres of land was enclosed. The British Parliament no longer watched this process from a distance. It passed 4,000 acts legalizing these enclosures. 1.2 New demands for grain. Why was there such a frantic effort to enclose lands? What did the enclosures imply? The new enclosures were different from the old. Unlike the 16th century enclosures that promoted sheep farming, the land being enclosed in the late 18th century was for grain production. The new enclosures were happening in a different context, they became a sign of a changing time. From the mid-18th century, the English population expanded rapidly. Between 1750 and 1900, it multiplied over 4 times, mounting from 7 million in 1750 to 21 million in 1850 and 30 million in 1900. This meant an increased demand for food grains to feed the population. Moreover, Britain at this time was industrializing. More and more people began to live and work in urban areas. Men from rural areas migrated to towns in search of jobs. To survive, they had to buy food grains in the market. As the urban population grew, the market for food grains expanded, and when demand increased rapidly, food grain prices rose. By the end of the 18th century, France was at war with England. This disrupted trade and the import of food grains from Europe. Prices of food grains in England skyrocketed, encouraging landowners to enclose lands and enlarge the area under grain cultivation. Profits flowed in and landowners pressurized the Parliament to pass the Enclosure Acts. 1.3 The Age of Enclosures. There is one dramatic fact that makes the period after the 1780s different from any earlier period in English history. In earlier times, rapid population growth was most often followed by a period of food shortages. Food grain production in the past had not expanded as rapidly as the population. In the 19th century, this did not happen in England. Grain production grew as quickly as population. Even though the population increased rapidly, in 1868 England was producing about 80% of the food it consumed. The rest was imported. This increase in food grain production was made possible not by any radical innovations in agricultural technology, but by bringing new lands under cultivation. Landlords sliced up pasturelands, carved up open fields, cut up forest commons, took over marshes, and turned larger and larger areas into agricultural fields. Farmers at this time continued to use the simple innovations in agriculture that had become common by the early 18th century. It was in about the 1660s that farmers in many parts of England began growing turnip and clover. They soon discovered that planting these crops improved the soil and made it more fertile. Turnip was, moreover, a good fodder crop relished by cattle. So farmers began cultivating turnips and clover regularly. These crops became part of the cropping system. Later findings showed that these crops had the capacity to increase the nitrogen content of the soil. Nitrogen was important for crop growth. Cultivation of the same soil over a few years depleted the nitrogen in the soil and reduced its fertility. By restoring nitrogen, turnip and clover made the soil fertile once again. We find that farmers in the early 19th century used much the same method to improve agriculture on a more regular basis. Enclosures were now seen as necessary to make long-term investments on land and plan crop rotations to improve the soil. Enclosures also allowed the richer landowners to expand the land under their control and produce more for the market. 1.4 What happened to the poor? Enclosures filled the pockets of landlords. But what happened to those who depended on the commons for their survival? When fences came up, the enclosed land became the exclusive property of one landowner. The poor could no longer collect their firewood from the forests, or graze their cattle on the commons. They could no longer collect apples and berries, or hunt small animals for meat. Nor could they gather the stalks that lay on the fields after the crops were cut. Everything belonged to the landlords, everything had a price which the poor could not afford to pay. In places where enclosures happened on an extensive scale, particularly the Midlands and the counties around, the poor were displaced from the land. They found their customary rights gradually disappearing. Deprived of their rights and driven off the land, they tramped in search of work. From the Midlands, they moved to the southern counties of England. This was a region that was most intensively cultivated, and there was a great demand for agricultural laborers. But nowhere could the poor find secure jobs. Earlier, it was common for laborers to live with landowners. They ate at the master's table, and helped their master through the year, doing a variety of odd jobs. By 1800 this practice was disappearing. Laborers were being paid wages and employed only during harvest time. As landowners tried to increase their profits, they cut the amount they had to spend on their workmen. Work became insecure, employment uncertain, income unstable. For a very large part of the year the poor had no work. 1.5 The introduction of threshing machines. During the Napoleonic Wars, prices of food grains were high and farmers expanded production vigorously. Fearing a shortage of labor, they began buying the new threshing machines that had come into the market. They complained of the insolence of laborers, their drinking habits, and the difficulty of making them work. The machines, they thought, would help them reduce their dependence on laborers. After the Napoleonic Wars had ended, thousands of soldiers returned to the villages. They needed alternative jobs to survive. But this was a time when grain from Europe began flowing into England, prices declined, and an agricultural depression set in. See prices in Fig. Point 2. Anxious, landowners began reducing the area they cultivated and demanded that the imports of crops be stopped. They tried to cut wages and the number of workmen they employed. The unemployed poor tramped from village to village, and those with uncertain jobs lived in fear of a loss of their livelihood. The Captain Swing riots spread in the countryside at this time. For the poor, the threshing machines had become a sign of bad times. Conclusion. The coming of modern agriculture in England thus meant many different changes. The open fields disappeared, and the customary rights of peasants were undermined. The richer farmers expanded grain production, sold this grain in the world market, made profits, and became powerful. The poor left their villages in large numbers. Some went from the Midlands to the southern counties where jobs were available, others to the cities. The income of laborers became unstable, their jobs insecure, their livelihood precarious. 2. Breadbasket and Dust Bowl. Now let us travel across the Atlantic to the USA. Let us see how modern agriculture developed there, how the USA became the breadbasket of the world, and what this meant to the rural people of America. At the time that common fields were being enclosed in England at the end of the 18th century, settled agriculture had not developed on any extensive scale in the USA. Forests covered over 800 million acres and grasslands 600 million acres. Fig. Point 5 will give you some idea of what the natural vegetation was like at the time. Most of the landscape was not under the control of white Americans. Till the 1780s, white American settlements were confined to a small narrow strip of coastal land in the east. If you traveled through the country at that time, you would have met various Native American groups. Several of them were nomadic, some were settled. Many of them lived only by hunting, gathering and fishing, others cultivated corn, beans, tobacco and pumpkin. Still others were expert trappers through whom European traders had secured their supplies of beaver fur since the 16th century. In Fig. Point 5 you can see the location of the different tribes in the early 18th century. By the early 20th century, this landscape had transformed radically. White Americans had moved westward and established control up to the west coast, displacing local tribes and carving out the entire landscape into different agricultural belts. The USA had come to dominate the world market in agricultural produce. How did this change come about? Who were the new settlers? How did the spread of cultivation shape the lives of the Indian groups who had once lived there? 2.1 The westward move in wheat cultivation. The story of agrarian expansion is closely connected to the westward movement of the white settlers who took over the land. After the American War of Independence from 1775 to 1783 and the formation of the United States of America, the white Americans began to move westward. By the time Thomas Jefferson became President of the USA in 1800, over 700,000 white settlers had moved on to the Appalachian Plateau through the passes. Seen from the East Coast, America seemed to be a land of promise. Its wilderness could be turned into cultivated fields. Forest timber could be cut for export, animals hunted for skin, mountains mined for gold and minerals. But this meant that the American Indians had to be cleared from the land. In the decades after 1800, the U.S. government committed itself to a policy of driving the American Indians westward, first beyond the river Mississippi, and then further west. Numerous wars were waged in which Indians were massacred and many of their villages burnt. The Indians resisted, won many victories in wars, but were ultimately forced to sign treaties, give up their land and move westward. As the Indians retreated, the settlers poured in. They came in successive waves. They settled on the Appalachian Plateau by the first decade of the 18th century, and then moved into the Mississippi Valley between 1820 and 1850. They slashed and burnt forests, pulled out the stumps, cleared the land for cultivation, and built log cabins in the forest clearings. Then they cleared larger areas, and erected fences around the fields. They plowed the land and sowed corn and wheat. In the early years, the fertile soil produced good crops. When the soil became impoverished and exhausted in one place, the migrants would move further west, to explore new lands and raise a new crop. It was, however, only after the 1860s that settlers swept into the Great Plains across the river Mississippi. In subsequent decades, this region became a major wheat-producing area of America. Let us follow the story of the wheat farmers in some detail. Let us see how they turned the grasslands into the breadbasket of America, what problems they faced, and what consequences followed. 2.2 The wheat farmers. From the late 19th century, there was a dramatic expansion of wheat production in the USA. The urban population in the USA was growing and the export market was becoming ever bigger. As the demand increased, wheat prices rose, encouraging farmers to produce wheat. The spread of the railways made it easy to transport the grain from the wheat-growing regions to the eastern coast for export. By the early 20th century the demand became even higher, and during the First World War the world market boomed. Russian supplies of wheat were cut off and the USA had to feed Europe. U.S. President Wilson called upon farmers to respond to the need of the time. "Plant more wheat, wheat will win the war," he said. In 1910, about 45 million acres of land in the USA was under wheat. 9 years later, the area had expanded to 74 million acres, an increase of about 65%. Most of the increase was in the Great Plains where new areas were being plowed to extend cultivation. In many cases, big farmers, the wheat barons, controlled as much as 2,000 to 3,000 acres of land individually. 2.3 The coming of new technology. This dramatic expansion was made possible by new technology. Through the 19th century, as the settlers moved into new habitats and new lands, they modified their implements to meet their requirements. When they entered the Midwestern prairie, the simple plows the farmers had used in the eastern coastal areas of the USA proved ineffective. The prairie was covered with a thick mat of grass with tough roots. To break the sod and turn the soil over, a variety of new plows were devised locally, some of them 12 feet long. Their front rested on small wheels and they were hitched onto 6 yokes of oxen or horses. By the early 20th century, farmers in the Great Plains were breaking the ground with tractors and disc plows, clearing vast stretches for wheat cultivation. Once the crop had ripened it had to be harvested. Before the 1830s, the grain used to be harvested with a cradle or sickle. At harvest time, hundreds of men and women could be seen in the fields cutting the crop. In 1831, Cyrus McCormick invented the first mechanical reaper which could cut in one day as much as 5 men could cut with cradles and 16 men with sickles. By the early 20th century, most farmers were using combined harvesters to cut grain. With one of these machines, 500 acres of wheat could be harvested in 2 weeks. For the big farmers of the Great Plains these machines had many attractions. The prices of wheat were high and the demand seemed limitless. The new machines allowed these big farmers to rapidly clear large tracts, break up the soil, remove the grass and prepare the ground for cultivation. The work could be done quickly and with a minimal number of hands. With power-driven machinery, 4 men could plow, seed and harvest 2,000 to 4,000 acres of wheat in a season. 2.4 What happened to the poor? For the poorer farmers, machines brought misery. Many of them bought these machines, imagining that wheat prices would remain high and profits would flow in. If they had no money, the banks offered loans. Those who borrowed found it difficult to pay back their debts. Many of them deserted their farms and looked for jobs elsewhere. But jobs were difficult to find. Mechanization had reduced the need for labor. And the boom of the late 19th and early 20th centuries seemed to have come to an end by the mid-1920s. After that, most farmers faced trouble. Production had expanded so rapidly during the war and post-war years that there was a large surplus. Unsold stocks piled up, storehouses overflowed with grain, and vast amounts of corn and wheat were turned into animal feed. Wheat prices fell and export markets collapsed. This created the grounds for the Great Agrarian Depression of the 1930s that ruined wheat farmers everywhere. 2.5 Dust Bowl. The expansion of wheat agriculture in the Great Plains created other problems. In the 1930s, terrifying dust storms began to blow over the southern plains. Black blizzards rolled in, very often 7,000 to 8,000 feet high, rising like monstrous waves of muddy water. They came day after day, year after year, through the 1930s. As the skies darkened, and the dust swept in, people were blinded and choked. Cattle were suffocated to death, their lungs caked with dust and mud. Sand buried fences, covered fields, and coated the surfaces of rivers till the fish died. Dead bodies of birds and animals were strewn all over the landscape. Tractors and machines that had plowed the earth and harvested the wheat in the 1920s were now clogged with dust, damaged beyond repair. What had gone wrong? Why these dust storms? In part they came because the early 1930s were years of persistent drought. The rains failed year after year, and temperatures soared. The wind blew with ferocious speed. But ordinary dust storms became black blizzards only because the entire landscape had been plowed over, stripped of all grass that held it together. When wheat cultivation had expanded dramatically in the early 19th century, zealous farmers had recklessly uprooted all vegetation, and tractors had turned the soil over, and broken the sod into dust. The whole region had become a dust bowl. The American dream of a land of plenty had turned into a nightmare. The settlers had thought that they could conquer the entire landscape, turn all land over to growing crops that could yield profits. After the 1930s, they realized that they had to respect the ecological conditions of each region. 3. The Indian farmer and opium production. Let us now move to India and see what was happening in the Indian countryside in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. As you know, British rule was gradually established in India after the Battle of Plassey, 1757. Over the period of colonial rule, the rural landscape was radically transformed. The British saw land revenue as a major source of government income. To build the resources of the state, efforts were made to impose a regular system of land revenue, increase revenue rates, and expand the area under cultivation. As cultivation expanded, the area under forests and pastures declined. All this created many problems for peasants and pastoralists. They found their access to forests and grazing lands increasingly restricted by rules and regulations. And they struggled to meet the pressures of government revenue demand. In the colonial period, rural India also came to produce a range of crops for the world market. In the early 19th century, indigo and opium were two of the major commercial crops. By the end of the century, peasants were producing sugarcane, cotton, jute, wheat and several other crops for export to feed the population of urban Europe and to supply the mills of Lancashire and Manchester in England. How did Indian cultivators respond to their entry into the modern world of international commerce and trade? Let us look at the history of one crop, opium, to get an idea of what colonial rule meant to peasants, and how the market operated in the colonies. 3.1 A Taste for Tea, the Trade with China. The history of opium production in India was linked up with the story of British trade with China. In the late 18th century, the English East India Company was buying tea and silk from China for sale in England. As tea became a popular English drink, the tea trade became more and more important. In 1785, about 15 million pounds of tea was being imported into England. By 1830, the figure had jumped to over 30 million pounds. In fact, the profits of the East India Company came to depend on the tea trade. This created a problem. England at this time produced nothing that could be easily sold in China. The Confucian rulers of China, the Manchus, were suspicious of all foreign merchants. They feared that the merchants would meddle in local politics and disrupt their authority. So the Manchus were unwilling to allow the entry of foreign goods. In such a situation, how could Western merchants finance the tea trade? How could they balance their trade? They could buy tea only by paying in silver coins or bullion. This meant an outflow of treasure from England, a prospect that created widespread anxiety. It was believed that a loss of treasure would impoverish the nation and deplete its wealth. Merchants therefore looked for ways to stop this loss of silver. They searched for a commodity they could sell in China, something they could persuade the Chinese to buy. Opium was such a commodity. The Portuguese had introduced opium into China in the early 16th century. Opium was, however, known primarily for its medical properties and used in minuscule quantities for certain types of medicines. The Chinese were aware of the dangers of opium addiction, and the emperor had forbidden its production and sale except for medicinal purposes. But Western merchants in the mid-18th century began an illegal trade in opium. It was unloaded in a number of seaports of southeastern China and carried by local agents to the interiors. By the early 1820s, about 10,000 crates were being annually smuggled into China. 15 years later, over 35,000 crates were being unloaded every year. While the English cultivated a taste for Chinese tea, the Chinese became addicted to opium. People of all classes took to the drug, shopkeepers and peddlers, officials and army men, aristocrats and paupers. Lin Zixu, special commissioner at Canton in 1839, estimated that there were over 4 million opium smokers in China. A British doctor in Canton put the figure at 12 million. As China became a country of opium addicts, British trade in tea flourished. The returns from opium sale financed the tea purchases in China. 3.2 Where did opium come from? This is where the Indian peasants come into the story. When the British conquered Bengal, they made a determined effort to produce opium in the lands under their control. As the market for opium expanded in China, larger volumes of opium flowed out of Bengal ports. Before 1767, no more than 500 chests, of 2 mons each, were being exported from India. Within 4 years, the quantity trebled. 100 years later, in 1870, the government was exporting about 50,000 chests annually. Supplies had to be increased to feed this booming export trade. But this was not easy. How could the cultivators be persuaded to grow opium? For a variety of reasons, they were unwilling to turn their fields over to poppy. First, the crop had to be grown on the best land, on fields that lay near villages and were well manured. On this land peasants usually produced pulses. If they planted opium on this land, then pulses could not be grown there, or they would have to be grown on inferior land where harvests were poorer and uncertain. Second, many cultivators owned no land. To cultivate, they had to pay rent and lease land from landlords. And the rent charged on good lands near villages was very high. Third, the cultivation of opium was a difficult process. The plant was delicate, and cultivators had to spend long hours nurturing it. This meant that they did not have enough time to care for other crops. Finally, the price the government paid to the cultivators for the opium they produced was very low. It was unprofitable for cultivators to grow opium at that price. 3.3 How were unwilling cultivators made to produce opium? Unwilling cultivators were made to produce opium through a system of advances. In the rural areas of Bengal and Bihar, there were large numbers of poor peasants. They never had enough to survive. It was difficult for them to pay rent to the landlord or to buy food and clothing. From the 1780s, such peasants found their village headman, Mahato, giving them money advances to produce opium. When offered a loan, the cultivators were tempted to accept, hoping to meet their immediate needs and pay back the loan at a later stage. But the loan tied the peasant to the headman and threw him to the government. It was the government opium agents who were advancing the money to the headman, who in turn gave it to the cultivators. By taking the loan, the cultivator was forced to grow opium on a specified area of land and hand over the produce to the agents once the crop had been harvested. He had no option of planting the field with a crop of his choice or of selling his produce to anyone but the government agent. And he had to accept the low price offered for the produce. The problem could have been partly solved by increasing the price of opium. But the government was reluctant to do so. It wanted to produce opium at a cheap rate and sell it at a high price to opium agents in Calcutta, who then shipped it to China. This difference between the buying and selling price was the government's opium revenue. The prices given to the peasants were so low that by the early 18th century angry peasants began agitating for higher prices and refused to take advances. In regions around Benares, cultivators began giving up opium cultivation. They produced sugarcane and potatoes instead. Many cultivators sold off their crop to traveling traders, pikers, who offered higher prices. By 1773, the British government in Bengal had established a monopoly to trade in opium. No one else was legally permitted to trade in the product. By the 1820s, the British found to their horror that opium production in their territories was rapidly declining, but its production outside the British territories was increasing. It was being produced in central India and Rajasthan, within princely states that were not under British control. In these regions, local traders were offering much higher prices to peasants and exporting opium to China. In fact, armed bands of traders were found carrying on the trade in the 1820s. To the British this trade was illegal, it was smuggling and it had to be stopped. Government monopoly had to be retained. It therefore instructed its agents posted in the princely states to confiscate all opium and destroy the crops. This conflict between the British government, peasants and local traders continued as long as opium production lasted. We should not, however, think that the experiences of all peasants in colonial India were like those of the opium cultivators. We will read about other experiences of peasants in colonial India in a later chapter. Conclusion. In this chapter you saw how rural areas in different parts of the world changed in the modern period. While looking at these changes we must remember that their pattern was not the same everywhere. All sections of rural people were not affected in the same way. Some gained, others lost. Nor was the history of modernization simply a glorious story of growth and development. It was also a story of displacements and impoverishment, ecological crises and social rebellion, colonization and repression. We need to look at these variations and strands to understand the diverse ways in which peasants and farmers confronted the modern world. New words. Bushel, a measure of capacity. Sod, pieces of earth with grass. Mons, a measure of weight. 1 mond equals 40 seers. 1 seer is a little over a kilogram. Source A. The threatening letters circulated widely. At times the threats were gentle, at others severe. Some of them were as brief as the following. Sir, this is to acquaint you that if your thrashing machines are not destroyed by you directly, we shall commence our labors. Signed on behalf of the whole. Swing. From E.J. Hobsbawm and George Rood. Captain Swing. Source B. This Swing letter is an example of a sterner threat. Sir, your name is down amongst the black hearts in the black book, and this is to advise you and the like of you, who are to make your wills. Ye have been the blackguard enemies of the people on all occasions, ye have not yet done as ye ought. Swing. Source C. One peasant who lost his rights to common land after the enclosures wrote to the local lord. Should a poor man take one of your sheep from the common, his life would be forfeited by law. But should you take the common from 100 poor men's sheep, the law gives no redress. The poor man is liable to be hung for taking from you what would not supply you with a meal, and you would do nothing illegal by depriving him of his subsistence. What should be the inference of the poor, when the laws are not accessible to the injured poor and the government gives them no redress? Source: J.M. Neeson, Commoners, Common Rights, Enclosures and Social Change, 1700-1820, 1993. Source D. In contrast, many writers emphasized the advantages of enclosures. There can be no question of the superior profit to the farmer of enclosures rather than open fields. In one case he is in chains, he can make no changes in soil or prices, he is like a horse and team, he must jog along with the rest. John Middleton, an 18th-century writer. Source E. In 1839, the Chinese emperor sent Lin Zexu to Canton as a special commissioner with instructions to stop the opium trade. After he arrived in Canton in the spring of 1839, Lin arrested 600 men involved in the trade, and confiscated 11,000 pounds of opium. Then he forced the foreign factories to hand over their stocks of opium, burned 20,000 crates of opium and blew the ashes to the wind. When he announced that Canton was closed to foreign trade, Britain declared war. Defeated in the Opium War 1837–42, the Chinese were forced to accept the humiliating terms of the subsequent treaties, legalizing opium trade and opening up China to foreign merchants. Before the war, Lin wrote a strong letter to Queen Victoria criticizing the trade in opium. Here is an extract from Lin's letter of advice to Queen Victoria. All those people in China who sell opium or smoke opium should receive the death penalty. We trace the crime of those barbarians who through the years have been selling opium, then the deep harm they have wrought and the great profit they have usurped should fundamentally justify their execution according to law. We find your country is 60 or 70,000 li, 3 li make 1 mile, ordinarily, from China. Yet there are barbarian ships that strive to come here for trade for the purpose of making a great profit. The wealth of China is used to profit the barbarians. That is to say, the great profit made by barbarians is all taken from the rightful share of China. By what right do they then in return us the poisonous drug to injure the Chinese people? Let us ask, where is your conscience? I have heard that the smoking of opium is very strictly forbidden by your country, that is because the harm caused by opium is clearly understood. Since it is not permitted to do harm to your own country, then even less should you let it be passed on to the harm of other countries, how much less to China. Source: from Siyu Teng and John Fairbank, China's Response to the West, 1954. Source F. The deputy opium agent of Allahabad wrote in 1833. The board appears to think that the cultivators are not unwilling to cultivate. For 2 years past I have had constant communications with the cultivators in some of the districts south of the Jumna and state positively the people are discontented and dissatisfied almost to a man. I have made many enquiries on the subject, and the impression left on my mind is that cultivation of the poppy is considered a curse by the people, and that only by undue authority is it upheld. The cultivation was introduced at the request, nay I may say, at the command of the collector. The people tell me, they are ill-used and abused and even beaten by the Chuprasis. The people almost uniformly told, they suffered loss from poppy. From Benoy Chowdhury, Growth of Commercial Agriculture in Bengal. Chapter 7. History and Sport, the Story of Cricket. Cricket grew out of the many stick and ball games played in England 500 years ago, under a variety of different rules. The word bat is an Old English word that simply means stick or club. By the 17th century, cricket had evolved enough to be recognizable as a distinct game, and it was popular enough for its fans to be fined for playing it on Sunday instead of going to church. Till the middle of the 18th century, bats were roughly the same shape as hockey sticks, curving outwards at the bottom. There was a simple reason for this: the ball was bowled underarm, along the ground, and the curve at the end of the bat gave the batsman the best chance of making contact. How that early version of cricket played in village England grew into the modern game played in giant stadiums in great cities is a proper subject for history, because one of the uses of history is to understand how the present was made. And sport is a large part of contemporary life. It is one way in which we amuse ourselves, compete with each other, stay fit, and express our social loyalties. If tens of millions of Indians today drop everything to watch the Indian team play a test match or a one-day international, it is reasonable for a history of India to explore how that stick and ball game invented in southeastern England became the ruling passion of the Indian subcontinent. This is particularly so, since the game was linked to the wider history of colonialism and nationalism, and was in part shaped by the politics of religion and caste. Our history of cricket will look first at the evolution of cricket as a game in England, and discuss the wider culture of physical training and athleticism of the time. It will then move to India, discuss the history of the adoption of cricket in this country, and trace the modern transformation of the game. In each of these sections we will see how the history of the game was connected to the social history of the time. 1. The historical development of cricket as a game in England. The social and economic history of England in the 18th and 19th centuries, cricket's early years, shaped the game and gave cricket its unique nature. For example, one of the peculiarities of Test cricket is that a match can go on for 5 days and still end in a draw. No other modern team sport takes even half as much time to complete. A football match is generally over in an hour and a half of playing time. Even baseball, a long drawn-out bat and ball game by the standards of modern sport, completes 9 innings in less than half the time that it takes to play a limited overs match, the shortened version of modern cricket. Another curious characteristic of cricket is that the length of the pitch is specified 22 yards, but the size or shape of the ground is not. Most other team sports, such as hockey and football, lay down the dimensions of the playing area. Cricket does not. Grounds can be oval like the Adelaide Oval or nearly circular, like Chepauk in Chennai. A 6 at the Melbourne Cricket Ground needs to clear much more ground than a lofted shot for the same reward at Firoz Shah Kotla in Delhi. There's a historical reason behind both these oddities. Cricket was the earliest modern team sport to be codified, which is another way of saying that cricket gave itself rules and regulations so that it could be played in a uniform and standardized way. Well before team games like soccer and hockey. The first written laws of cricket were drawn up in 1744. They stated, "The principals shall choose from amongst the gentlemen present 2 umpires who shall absolutely decide all disputes. The stumps must be 22 inches high and the bail across them 6 inches. The ball must be between 5 and 6 ounces, and the 2 sets of stumps 22 yards apart. There were no limits on the shape or size of the bat. It appears that 40 notches or runs was viewed as a very big score, probably due to the bowlers bowling quickly at shins unprotected by pads. The world's first cricket club was formed in Hambledon in the 1760s, and the Marylebone Cricket Club, MCC, was founded in 1787. In 1788, the MCC published its first revision of the laws and became the guardian of cricket's regulations. The MCC's revision of the laws brought in a series of changes in the game that occurred in the second half of the 18th century. During the 1760s and 1770s, it became common to pitch the ball through the air, rather than roll it along the ground. This change gave bowlers the options of length, deception through the air, plus increased pace. It also opened new possibilities for spin and swing. In response, batsmen had to master timing and shot selection. One immediate result was the replacement of the curved bat with the straight one. All of this raised the premium on skill and reduced the influence of rough ground and brute force. The weight of the ball was limited to between 5.5 to 5.75 ounces, and the width of the bat to 4 inches. The latter ruling followed an innings by a batsman who appeared with a bat as wide as the wicket. In 1774, the first leg before law was published. Also around this time, a third stump became common. By 1780, 3 days had become the length of a major match, and this year also saw the creation of the first six-seam cricket ball. While many important changes occurred during the 19th century, the rule about wide balls was applied, the exact circumference of the ball was specified, protective equipment like pads and gloves became available, boundaries were introduced where previously all shots had to be run, and, most importantly, overarm bowling became legal. Cricket remained a pre-industrial sport that matured during the early phase of the Industrial Revolution, the late 18th century. This history has made cricket a game with characteristics of both the past and the present day. Cricket's connection with a rural past can be seen in the length of a test match. Originally, cricket matches had no time limit. The game went on for as long as it took to bowl out a side twice. The rhythms of village life were slower, and cricket's rules were made before the Industrial Revolution. Modern factory work meant that people were paid by the hour or the day or the week. Games that were codified after the Industrial Revolution, like football and hockey, were strictly time-limited to fit the routines of industrial city life. In the same way, cricket's vagueness about the size of a cricket ground is a result of its village origins. Cricket was originally played on country commons, unfenced land that was public property. The size of the commons varied from one village to another, so there were no designated boundaries or boundary hits. When the ball went into the crowd cleared a way for the fieldsman to retrieve it. Even after boundaries were written into the laws of cricket, their distance from the wicket was not specified. The laws simply lay down that the umpire shall agree with both captains on the boundaries of the playing area. If you look at the game's equipment, you can see how cricket both changed with changing times and yet fundamentally remained true to its origins in rural England. Cricket's most important tools are all made of natural, pre-industrial materials. The bat is made of wood, as are the stumps and the bails. The ball is made with leather, twine and cork. Even today both bat and ball are handmade, not industrially manufactured. The material of the bat changed slightly over time. Once it was cut out of a single piece of wood. Now it consists of two pieces, the blade which is made out of the wood of the willow tree and the handle which is made out of cane, that became available as European colonialists and trading companies established themselves in Asia. Unlike golf and tennis, cricket has refused to remake its tools with industrial or man-made materials. Plastic, fiberglass and metal have been firmly rejected. Australian cricketer Dennis Lillee tried to play an innings with an aluminium bat, only to have it outlawed by the umpires. But in the matter of protective equipment, cricket has been influenced by technological change. The invention of vulcanized rubber led to the introduction of pads in 1848 and protective gloves soon afterwards, and the modern game would be unimaginable without helmets made out of metal and synthetic lightweight materials. 1.1 Cricket in Victorian England. The organisation of cricket in England reflected the nature of English society. The rich who could afford to play it for pleasure were called amateurs and the poor who played it for a living were called professionals. The rich were amateurs for two reasons. 1. They considered sport a kind of leisure. To play for the pleasure of playing and not for money was an aristocratic value. 2. There was not enough money in the game for the rich to be interested. The wages of professionals were paid by patronage or subscription or gate money. The game was seasonal and did not offer employment the year round. Most professionals worked as miners or in other forms of working-class employment in winter, the off-season. The social superiority of amateurs was built into the customs of cricket. Amateurs were called gentlemen while professionals had to be content with being described as players. They even entered the ground from different entrances. Amateurs tended to be batsmen, leaving the energetic, hard-working aspects of the game, like fast bowling, to the professionals. That is partly why the laws of the game always give the benefit of the doubt to the batsman. Cricket is a batsman's game because its rules were made to favour gentlemen, who did most of the batting. The social superiority of the amateur was also the reason the captain of a cricket team was traditionally a batsman, not because batsmen were naturally better captains but because they were generally gentlemen. Captains of teams, whether club teams or national sides, were always amateurs. It was not till the 1930s that the English Test team was led by a professional, the Yorkshire batsman, Len Hutton. It's often said that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eden. This means that Britain's military success was based on the values taught to schoolboys in its public schools. Eden was the most famous of these schools. The English boarding school was the institution that trained English boys for careers in the military, the civil service and the church, the three great institutions of Imperial England. By the beginning of the 19th century, men like Thomas Arnold, headmaster of the famous rugby school and founder of the modern public school system, saw team sport like cricket and rugby not just as outdoor play, but as an organized way of teaching English boys the discipline, the importance of hierarchy, the skills, the codes of honor and the leadership qualities that helped them build and run the British Empire. Victorian empire builders justified the conquest of other countries as an act of unselfish social service, by which backward peoples were introduced to the civilizing influence of British law and Western knowledge. Cricket helped to confirm this self-image of the English elite by glorifying the amateur ideal, where cricket was played not for victory or profit, but for its own sake, in the spirit of fair play. In actual fact, the Napoleonic Wars were won because of the economic contribution of the iron works of Scotland and Wales, the mills of Lancashire and the financial houses of the City of London. It was the English lead in trade and industry that made Britain the world's greatest power, but it suited the English ruling class to believe that it was the superior character of its young men, built in boarding schools, playing gentlemanly games like cricket, that tipped the balance. 2. The spread of cricket. While some English team games like hockey and football became international games, played all over the world, cricket remained a colonial game, limited to countries that had once been part of the British Empire. The pre-industrial oddness of cricket made it a hard game to export. It took root only in countries that the British conquered and ruled. In these colonies, cricket was established as a popular sport either by white settlers, as in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Australia, New Zealand, the West Indies and Kenya, or by local elites who wanted to copy the habits of their colonial masters, as in India. While British imperial officials brought the game to the colonies, they made little effort to spread the game, especially in colonial territories where the subjects of empire were mainly non-white, such as India and the West Indies. Here, playing cricket became a sign of superior social and racial status, and the Afro-Caribbean population was discouraged from participating in organized club cricket, which remained dominated by white plantation owners and their servants. The first non-white club in the West Indies was established towards the end of the 19th century, and even in this case its members were light-skinned mulattoes. So while black people laid an enormous amount of informal cricket on beaches, in back alleys and parks, club cricket till as late as the 1930s was dominated by white elites. Despite the exclusiveness of the white cricket elite in the West Indies, the game became hugely popular in the Caribbean. Success at cricket became a measure of racial equality and political progress. At the time of their independence, many of the political leaders of Caribbean countries like Forbes Burnham and Eric Williams saw in the game a chance for self-respect and international standing. When the West Indies won its first Test series against England in 1950, it was celebrated as a national achievement, as a way of demonstrating that West Indians were the equals of white Englishmen. There were two ironies to this great victory. 1. The West Indian team that won was captained by a white player. The first time a black player led the West Indies Test team was in 1960 when Frank Worrell was named captain. And 2. The West Indies cricket team represented not one nation but several dominions that later became independent countries. The Pan-West Indian team that represents the Caribbean region in international Test cricket is the only exception to a series of unsuccessful efforts to bring about West Indian unification. Cricket fans know that watching a match involves taking sides. In a Ranji Trophy match when Delhi plays Mumbai, the loyalty of spectators depends on which city they come from or support. When India plays Australia, the spectators watching the match on television in Bhopal or Chennai feel involved as Indians, they are moved by nationalist loyalties. But through the early history of Indian first-class cricket, teams were not organized on geographical principles, and it was not till 1932 that a national team was given the right to represent India in a Test match. So how were teams organized and, in the absence of regional or national teams, how did cricket fans choose sides? We turn to history for answers, to discover how cricket in India developed and to get a sense of the loyalties that united and divided Indians in the days of the Raj. 2.1 Cricket, Race and Religion. Cricket in colonial India was organized on the principle of race and religion. The first record we have of cricket being played in India is from 1721, an account of recreational cricket played by English sailors in Cambay. The first Indian club, the Calcutta Cricket Club, was established in 1792. Through the 18th century, cricket in India was almost wholly a sport played by British military men and civil servants in all-white clubs and gymkhanas. Playing cricket in the privacy of these clubs was more than just fun, it was also an escape from the strangeness, discomfort and danger of their stay in India. Indians were considered to have no talent for the game and certainly not meant to play it. But they did. The origins of Indian cricket, that is, cricket played by Indians, are to be found in Bombay, and the first Indian community to start playing the game was the small community of Zoroastrians, the Parsis. Brought into close contact with the British because of their interest in trade and the first Indian community to westernize, the Parsis founded the first Indian cricket club, the Oriental Cricket Club in Bombay in 1848. Parsi clubs were funded and sponsored by Parsi businessmen like the Tatas and the Wadias. The white cricket elite in India offered no help to the enthusiastic Parsis. In fact, there was a quarrel between the Bombay Gymkhana, a whites-only club, and Parsi cricketers over the use of a public park. The Parsis complained that the park was left unfit for cricket because the polo ponies of the Bombay Gymkhana dug up the surface. When it became clear that the colonial authorities were prejudiced in favor of their white compatriots, the Parsis built their own Gymkhana to play cricket in. The rivalry between the Parsis and the racist Bombay Gymkhana had a happy ending for these pioneers of Indian cricket. A Parsi team beat the Bombay Gymkhana at cricket in 1889, just 4 years after the foundation of the Indian National Congress in 1885, an organization that was lucky to have amongst its early leaders the great Parsi statesman and intellectual Dadabhai Naoroji. The establishment of the Parsi Gymkhana became a precedent for other Indians who in turn established clubs based on the idea of religious community. By the 1890s, Hindus and Muslims were busy gathering funds and support for a Hindu Gymkhana and an Islam Gymkhana. The British did not consider colonial India as a nation. They saw it as a collection of castes and races and religious communities and gave themselves the credit for unifying the subcontinent. In the late 19th century, many Indian institutions and movements were organized around the idea of religious community because the colonial state encouraged these divisions and was quick to recognize communal institutions. For example, the governor of the Bombay Presidency, while dealing with an application from the Islam Gymkhana for land on Bombay's seafront, wrote, "We can be certain that in a short time we shall get a similar application from some Hindu Gymkhana. I don't see how we are to refuse these applicants, but I will refuse any more grants once a Gymkhana has been established, by each nationality." Emphasis added. It is obvious from this letter that colonial officials regarded religious communities as separate nationalities. Applications that used the communal categories favored by the colonial state were, as this letter shows, more likely to be approved. This history of Gymkhana cricket led to first-class cricket being organized on communal and racial lines. The teams that played colonial India's greatest and most famous first-class cricket tournament did not represent regions, as teams in today's Ranji Trophy currently do, but religious communities. The tournament was initially called the Quadrangular, because it was played by 4 teams, the Europeans, the Parsis, the Hindus and the Muslims. It later became the Pentangular when a 5th team was added, namely, the rest, which comprised all the communities left over, such as the Indian Christians. For example, Vijay Hazare, a Christian, played for the rest. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, journalists, cricketers and political leaders had begun to criticize the racial and communal foundations of the Pentangular tournament. The distinguished editor of the newspaper The Bombay Chronicle, S.A. Brelby, the famous radio commentator A.F.S. Talyarkhan and India's most respected political figure, Mahatma Gandhi, condemned the Pentangular as a communally divisive competition that was out of place in a time when nationalists were trying to unite India's diverse population. A rival first-class tournament on regional lines, the National Cricket Championship, later named the Ranji Trophy, was established but not until independence did it properly replace the Pentangular. The colonial state and its divisive conception of India was the rock on which the Pentangular was built. It was a colonial tournament and it died with the Raj. 3. The modern transformation of the game. Modern cricket is dominated by tests and one-day internationals, played between national teams. The players who become famous, who live on in the memories of cricket's public, are those who have played for their country. The players Indian fans remember from the era of the Pentangular and the Quadrangular are those who were fortunate enough to play Test cricket. C.K. Naidu, an outstanding Indian batsman of his time, lives on in the popular imagination when some of his great contemporaries like Palwankar Vithal and Palwankar Balu have been forgotten because his career lasted long enough for him to play Test cricket for India while theirs did not. Even though Naidu was past his cricketing prime when he played for India in its first Test matches against England starting in 1932, his place in India's cricket history is assured because he was the country's first Test captain. India entered the world of Test cricket in 1932, a decade and a half before it became an independent nation. This was possible because Test cricket from its origins in 1877 was organised as a contest between different parts of the British Empire, not sovereign nations. The first Test was played between England and Australia when Australia was still a white settler colony, not even a self-governing dominion. Similarly, the small countries of the Caribbean that together make up the West Indies team were British colonies till well after the Second World War. 3.1 Decolonization in sport. Decolonization, or the process through which different parts of European empires became independent nations, began with the independence of India in 1947 and continued for the next half a century. This process led to the decline of British influence in trade, commerce, military affairs, international politics and, inevitably, sporting matters. But this did not happen at once. It took a while for the relative unimportance of post-imperial Britain to be reflected in the organisation of world cricket. Even after Indian independence kick-started the disappearance of the British Empire, the regulation of international cricket remained the business of the Imperial Cricket Conference (ICC). The ICC, renamed the International Cricket Conference as late as 1965, was dominated by its foundation members, England and Australia, which retained the right of veto over its proceedings. Not till 1989 was the privileged position of England and Australia scrapped in favour of equal membership. The colonial flavour of world cricket during the 1950s and 1960s can be seen from the fact that England and the other white Commonwealth countries, Australia and New Zealand, continued to play Test cricket with South Africa, a racist state that practiced a policy of racial segregation which, among other things, barred non-whites, who made up the majority of South Africa's population, from representing that country in Test matches. Test-playing nations like India, Pakistan and the West Indies boycotted South Africa, but they did not have the necessary power in the ICC to debar that country from Test cricket. That only came to pass when the political pressure to isolate South Africa applied by the newly decolonized nations of Asia and Africa combined with liberal feeling in Britain and forced the English cricket authorities to cancel a tour by South Africa in 1970. 4. Commerce, media and cricket today. The 1970s were the decade in which cricket was transformed. It was a time when a traditional game evolved to fit a changing world. If 1970 was notable for the exclusion of South Africa from international cricket, 1971 was a landmark year because the first one-day international was played between England and Australia in Melbourne. The enormous popularity of this shortened version of the game led to the first World Cup being successfully staged in 1975. Then in 1977, even as cricket celebrated 100 years of Test matches, the game was changed forever, not by a player or cricket administrator, but by a businessman. Kerry Packer, an Australian television tycoon who saw the money-making potential of cricket as a televised sport, signed up 51 of the world's leading cricketers against the wishes of the national cricket boards and for about 2 years staged unofficial tests and one-day internationals under the name of World Series Cricket. While Packer's circus, as it was then described, folded up after 2 years, the innovations he introduced during this time to make cricket more attractive to television audiences endured and changed the nature of the game. Colored dress, protective helmets, field restrictions, cricket under lights, became a standard part of the post-Packer game. Crucially, Packer drove home the lesson that cricket was a marketable game, which could generate huge revenues. Cricket boards became rich by selling television rights to television companies. Television channels made money by selling television spots to companies who were happy to pay large sums of money to air commercials for their products to cricket's captive television audience. Continuous television coverage made cricketers celebrities who, besides being paid better by their cricket boards, now made even larger sums of money by making commercials for a wide range of products, from tires to colas, on television. Television coverage changed cricket. It expanded the audience for the game by beaming cricket into small towns and villages. It also broadened cricket's social base. Children who had never previously had the chance to watch international cricket because they lived outside the big cities, where top-level cricket was played, could now watch and learn by imitating their heroes. The technology of satellite television and the worldwide reach of multinational television companies created a global market for cricket. Matches in Sydney could now be watched live in NCERT. This simple fact shifted the balance of power in cricket. A process that had been begun by the breakup of the British Empire was taken to its logical conclusion by globalization. Since India had the largest viewership for the game amongst the cricket-playing nations and the largest market in the cricketing world, the game's center of gravity shifted to South Asia. This shift was symbolized by the shifting of the ICC headquarters from London to tax-free Dubai. A more important sign that the center of gravity in cricket has shifted away from the old, Anglo-Australian axis is that innovations in cricket technique in recent years have mainly come from the practice of subcontinental teams in countries like India, Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Pakistan has pioneered two great advances in bowling, the doosra and the reverse swing. Both skills were developed in response to subcontinental conditions, the doosra to counter aggressive batsmen with heavy modern bats who were threatening to make fingerspin obsolete, and reverse swing to move the ball in on dusty, unresponsive wickets under clear skies. Initially, both innovations were greeted with great suspicion by countries like Britain and Australia, which saw them as an underhanded, illegal bending of the laws of cricket. In time, it came to be accepted that the laws of cricket could not continue to be framed for British or Australian conditions of play, and they became part of the technique of all bowlers, everywhere in the world. 150 years ago, the first Indian cricketers, the Parsis, had to struggle to find an open space to play in. Today, the global marketplace has made Indian players the best paid, most famous cricketers in the game, men for whom the world is a stage. The history that brought about this transformation was made up of many smaller changes: the replacement of the gentlemanly amateur by the paid professional, the triumph of the one-day game as it overshadowed Test cricket in terms of popularity, and the remarkable changes in global commerce and technology. The business of history is to make sense of change over time. In this chapter we have followed the spread of a colonial sport through its history, and tried to understand how it adapted to a post-colonial world. New words. Codified, made into a formalized system with clearly established rules and laws. Patronage, agreement by wealthy supporter to give financial support for a specific cause. Subscription, collected financial contribution for a specific purpose, such as cricket. Hierarchy, organized by rank and status. Mulattoes, people of mixed European and African descent. Dominion, self-governing areas under the control of the British Crown. Precedent, previous action which provides reason to repeat it. Segregation, separation, of people, on the basis of color or race. Source A. Thomas Hughes, 1822–1896, studied at Rugby School during the headmastership of Thomas Arnold. Based on his school experience, he wrote a novel, Tom Brown's Schooldays. The book, published in 1857, became popular and helped spread the ideas of what came to be called muscular Christianity, that believed that healthy citizens had to be molded through Christian ideals and sports. In this book, Tom Brown is transformed from a nervous, homesick, timid boy into a robust, manly student. He becomes a heroic figure recognized for his physical courage, sportsmanship, loyalty and patriotism. This transformation is brought about by the discipline of the public school and the culture of sports. Extract. Come, none of your irony, Brown, answers the master. I'm beginning to understand the game scientifically. What a noble game it is, too. Isn't it? But it's more than a game. It's an institution, said Tom. Yes, said Arthur, the birthright of British boys old and young, as habeas corpus and trial by jury are of British men. The discipline and reliance on one another which it teaches is so valuable, I think, went on the master, it ought to be such an unselfish game. It merges the individual in the 11, he doesn't play that he may win, but that his side may. That's very true, said Tom, and that's why football and cricket, now one comes to think of it, are such much better games than fives or hare and hounds, or any others where the object is to come in first or to win for oneself, and not that one's side may win. And then the captain of the 11. Said the master, what a post is his in our school world, requiring skill and gentleness and firmness, and I know not what other rare qualities. Extract from Tom Brown's Schooldays by Thomas Hughes. Source B. Sport for girls. Till the last part of the 19th century, sports and vigorous exercise for girls was not a part of their education. Dorothea Beale, principal of Cheltenham Ladies' College from 1858 to 1906, reported to the School's Enquiry Commission in 1864. The vigorous exercise which boys get from cricket, etc., must be supplied in the case of girls by walking and skipping. From Kathleen E. Macrone, play up, and play the game. Sport at the late Victorian Girls' Public School. By the 1890s, school began acquiring playgrounds and allowing girls to play some of the games earlier considered male preserves. But the competition was still discouraged. Dorothea Beale told the school council in 1893-1894. I am most anxious that girls should not overexert themselves, or become absorbed in athletic rivalries, and therefore we do not play against the other schools. I think it is better for girls to learn to take an interest in botany, geology, etc., and not make country excursions. From Kathleen E. Macrone, play up, and play the game. Source C. Mahatma Gandhi and colonial sport. Mahatma Gandhi believed that sport was essential for creating a balance between the body and the mind. However, he often emphasized that games like cricket and hockey were imported into India by the British and were replacing traditional games. Such games as cricket, hockey, football and tennis were for the privileged, he believed. They showed a colonial mindset and were a less effective education than the simple exercise of those who worked on the land. Read the following 3 extracts from Mahatma Gandhi's writing and contrast them to the ideas on education and sport expressed by Thomas Arnold or Hughes. Source A. Now let us examine our body. Are we supposed to cultivate the body by playing tennis, football or cricket for an hour every day? It does, certainly, build up the body. Like a wild horse, however, the body will be strong but not trained. A trained body is healthy, vigorous and sinewy. The hands and feet can do any desired work. A pickaxe, a shovel, a hammer, etc. are like ornaments to a trained hand and it can wield them. A well-trained body does not get tired in trudging 30 miles. Does the student acquire such physical culture? We can assert that modern curricula do not impart physical education in this sense. What is Education? The 11th of February 1926, The Collected Works of Mahatma Gandhi, Volume 34. I should, however, be exceedingly surprised and even painfully surprised, if I were told that before cricket and football descended upon your sacred soil, your boys were devoid of all games. If you have national games, I would urge upon you that yours is an institution that should lead in reviving old games. I know that we have in India many noble indigenous games just as interesting and exciting as cricket or football, also as much attended with risks as football is, but with the added advantage that they are inexpensive, because the cost is practically next to nothing. Speech at Mahindra College, 24 November 1927, The Collected Works of Mahatma Gandhi. A sound body means one which bends itself to the spirit and is always a ready instrument at its service. Such bodies are not made, in my opinion, on the football field. They are made on cornfields and farms. I would urge you to think this over and you will find innumerable illustrations to prove my statement. Our colonial-born Indians are carried away with this football and cricket mania. These games may have their place under certain circumstances. Why do we not take the simple fact into consideration that the vast majority of mankind who are vigorous in body and mind are simple agriculturists, that they are strangers to these games, and they are the salt of the earth? Letter to Lazarus, 17 April 1915, The Collected Works of Mahatma Gandhi. Box 1. Caste and Cricket. Palwankar Balu was born in Pune in 1875. Born at a time when Indians weren't allowed to play Test cricket, he was the greatest Indian slow bowler of his time. He played for the Hindus in the Quadrangular, the major cricket tournament of the colonial period. Despite being their greatest player, he was never made captain of the Hindus because he was born a Dalit and upper caste selectors discriminated against him. But his younger brother, Vithal, a batsman, did become captain of the Hindus in 1923 and led the team to a famous victory against the Europeans. Writing to a newspaper, a cricket fan made a connection between the Hindus' victory and Gandhiji's war on untouchability. The Hindus' brilliant victory was due more to the judicious and bold step of the Hindu Gymkhana in appointing Mr. Vithal, brother of Mr. Balu, premier bowler of India, who is a member of the untouchable class, to captain the Hindu team. The moral that can be safely drawn from the Hindus' magnificent victory is that removal of untouchability would lead to Swaraj, which is the prophecy of the Mahatma. A Corner of a Foreign Field by Ramachandra Guha. Box 2. Hockey, India's national game. Modern hockey evolved from traditional games once current in Britain. Amongst its sporting ancestors, hockey can count the Scottish game called shinty, the English and Welsh game called bandy, and Irish hurling. Hockey, like many other modern games, was introduced into India by the British Army in colonial times. The first hockey club in India was started in Calcutta in 1885–1886. India was represented in the hockey competition of the Olympic Games for the first time in 1928. India reached the finals defeating Austria, Belgium, Denmark and Switzerland. In the finals, India defeated Holland by 3-0. The brilliance and skill of players like the great Dhyan Chand brought India a string of Olympic gold medals. Between 1928 and 1956, India won gold medals in 6 consecutive Olympic Games. During this golden age of Indian dominance, India played 24 Olympic matches, and won them all, scored 178 goals, at an average of 7.43 goals per match, and conceded only 7 goals. The 2 other gold medals for India came in the 1964 Tokyo Olympics and the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Box 3. Polo was greatly favored as a game suitable for military and athletic young men. Following one of the earliest games in England, a report in the Illustrated London News declared, "As an exercise, for military men this bold and graceful sport is likely to give increased dexterity in the use of the lance or saber, or other cavalry weapons, as well as a firmer seat in the saddle, and a faculty of quickly turning to the right hand or to the left, which must be effective in the melee of battle." From Illustrated London News, 1872. Chapter 8. Clothing, A Social History. It is easy to forget that there is a history to the clothes we wear. All societies observe certain rules, some of them quite strict, about the way in which men, women and children should dress, or how different social classes and groups should present themselves. These norms come to define the identity of people, the way they see themselves, the way they want others to see them. They shape our notions of grace and beauty, ideas of modesty and shame. As times change and societies are transformed, these notions also alter. Modifications in clothing come to reflect these changes. The emergence of the modern world is marked by dramatic changes in clothing. In this chapter, we will look at some of the histories of clothing in the modern period, that is in the 19th and 20th centuries. Why are these two centuries important? Before the age of democratic revolutions and the development of capitalist markets in 18th century Europe, most people dressed according to their regional codes, and were limited by the types of clothes and the cost of materials that were available in their region. Clothing styles were also strictly regulated by class, gender or status in the social hierarchy. After the 18th century, the colonization of most of the world by Europe, the spread of democratic ideals and the growth of an industrial society, completely changed the ways in which people thought about dress and its meanings. People could use styles and materials that were drawn from other cultures and locations, and Western dress styles for men were adopted worldwide. In Chapter 1 you have seen how the French Revolution transformed many aspects of social and political life. The revolution also swept away existing dress codes, known as the sumptuary laws. Let us look briefly at what these laws were. 1. Sumptuary laws and social hierarchy. In medieval Europe, dress codes were sometimes imposed upon members of different layers of society through actual laws which were spelt out in some detail. From about 1294 to the time of the French Revolution in 1789, the people of France were expected to strictly follow what were known as sumptuary laws. The laws tried to control the behavior of those considered social inferiors, preventing them from wearing certain clothes, consuming certain foods and beverages, usually this referred to alcohol, and hunting game in certain areas. In medieval France, the items of clothing a person could purchase per year was regulated, not only by income but also by social rank. The material to be used for clothing was also legally prescribed. Only royalty could wear expensive materials like ermine and fur, or silk, velvet and brocade. Other classes were debarred from clothing themselves with materials that were associated with the aristocracy. The French Revolution ended these distinctions. As you know from Chapter 1, members of the Jacobin clubs even called themselves the sans-culottes to distinguish themselves from the aristocracy who wore the fashionable knee breeches. Sans-culottes literally meant those without knee breeches. From now on, both men and women began wearing clothing that was loose and comfortable. The colors of France, blue, white and red, became popular as they were a sign of the patriotic citizen. Other political symbols too became a part of dress, the red cap of liberty, long trousers and the revolutionary cockade pinned onto a hat. The simplicity of clothing was meant to express the idea of equality. 2. Clothing and notions of beauty. The end of sumptuary laws did not mean that everyone in European societies could now dress in the same way. The French Revolution had raised the question of equality and ended aristocratic privileges, as well as the laws that maintained those privileges. However, differences between social strata remained. Clearly, the poor could not dress like the rich, nor eat the same food. But laws no longer barred people's right to dress in the way they wished. Differences in earning, rather than sumptuary laws, now defined what the rich and poor could wear. And different classes developed their own culture of dress. The notion of what was beautiful or ugly, proper or improper, decent or vulgar, differed. Styles of clothing also emphasized differences between men and women. Women in Victorian England were groomed from childhood to be docile and dutiful, submissive and obedient. The ideal woman was one who could bear pain and suffering. While men were expected to be serious, strong, independent and aggressive, women were seen as frivolous, delicate, passive and docile. Norms of clothing reflected these ideals. From childhood, girls were tightly laced up and dressed in stays. The effort was to restrict the growth of their bodies, contain them within small molds. When slightly older, girls had to wear tight-fitting corsets. Tightly laced, small-waisted women were admired as attractive, elegant and graceful. Clothing thus played a part in creating the image of frail, submissive Victorian women. 2.1 How did women react to these norms? Many women believed in the ideals of womanhood. The ideals were in the air they breathed, the literature they read, the education they had received at school and at home. From childhood they grew up to believe that having a small waist was a womanly duty. Suffering pain was essential to being a woman. To be seen as attractive, to be womanly, they had to wear the corset. The torture and pain this inflicted on the body was to be accepted as normal. But not everyone accepted these values. Over the 19th century, ideas changed. By the 1830s, women in England began agitating for democratic rights. As the suffrage movement developed, many began campaigning for dress reform. Women's magazines described how tight dresses and corsets caused deformities and illness among young girls. Such clothing restricted body growth and hampered blood circulation. Muscles remained underdeveloped and the spines got bent. Doctors reported that many women were regularly complaining of acute weakness, felt languid, and fainted frequently. Corsets then became necessary to hold up the weakened spine. In America, a similar movement developed amongst the white settlers on the East Coast. Traditional feminine clothes were criticized on a variety of grounds. Long skirts, it was said, swept the grounds and collected filth and dirt. This caused illness. The skirts were voluminous and difficult to handle. They hampered movement and prevented women from working and earning. Reform of the dress, it was said, would change the position of women. If clothes were comfortable and convenient, then women could work, earn their living, and become independent. In the 1870s, the National Woman Suffrage Association headed by Mrs. Stanton, and the American Woman Suffrage Association dominated by Lucy Stone both campaigned for dress reform. The argument was, simplified dress, shorten skirts, and abandon corsets. On both sides of the Atlantic, there was now a movement for rational dress reform. The reformers did not immediately succeed in changing social values. They had to face ridicule and hostility. Conservatives everywhere opposed change. They lamented that women who gave up traditional norms of dressing no longer looked beautiful, and lost their femininity and grace. Faced with persistent attacks, many women reformers changed back into traditional clothes to conform to conventions. By the end of the 19th century, however, change was clearly in the air. Ideals of beauty and styles of clothing were both transformed under a variety of pressures. People began accepting the ideas of reformers they had earlier ridiculed. With new times came new values. 3 new times. What were these new values? What created the pressure for change? Many changes were made possible in Britain due to the introduction of new materials and technologies. Other changes came about because of the 2 world wars and the new working conditions for women. Let us retrace our steps a few centuries to see what these changes were. 3.1 New materials. Before the 17th century, most ordinary women in Britain possessed very few clothes made of flax, linen or wool, which were difficult to clean. After 1600, trade with India brought cheap, beautiful and easy to maintain Indian chintzes within the reach of many Europeans who could now increase the size of their wardrobes. Then, during the Industrial Revolution, in the 19th century, Britain began the mass manufacture of cotton textiles which it exported to many parts of the world, including India. Cotton clothes became more accessible to a wider section of people in Europe. By the early 20th century, artificial fibers made clothes cheaper still and easier to wash and maintain. In the late 1870s, heavy, restrictive underclothes, which had created such a storm in the pages of women's magazines, were gradually discarded. Clothes got lighter, shorter and simpler, yet until 1914, clothes were ankle-length, as they had been since the 13th century. By 1915, however, the hemline of the skirt rose dramatically to mid-calf. Why this sudden change? 3.2 The war. Changes in women's clothing came about as a result of the two world wars. Many European women stopped wearing jewelry and luxurious clothes. As upper-class women mixed with other classes, social barriers were eroded and women began to look similar. Clothes got shorter during the First World War, 1914–1918, out of practical necessity. By 1917, over 700,000 women in Britain were employed in ammunition factories. They wore a working uniform of blouse and trousers with accessories such as scarves, which was later replaced by khaki overalls and caps. Bright colors faded from sight and only sober colors were worn as the war dragged on. Thus clothes became plainer and simpler. Skirts became shorter. Soon trousers became a vital part of Western women's clothing, giving them greater freedom of movement. Most important, women took to cutting their hair short for convenience. By the 20th century, a plain and austere style came to reflect seriousness and professionalism. New schools for children emphasized the importance of plain dressing, and discouraged ornamentation. Gymnastics and games entered the school curriculum for women. As women took to sports, they had to wear clothes that did not hamper movement. When they went out to work, they needed clothes that were comfortable and convenient. So we see that the history of clothing is linked to the larger history of society. We saw how clothing was defined by dominant cultural attitudes and ideals of beauty, and how these notions changed over time. We saw how reformers and conservatives struggled to shape these ideals, and how changes within technology and economy, and the pressures of new times made people feel the need for change. 4 transformations in colonial India. What about India in this same period? During the colonial period there were significant changes in male and female clothing in India. On the one hand, this was a consequence of the influence of Western dress forms and missionary activity, on the other it was due to the effort by Indians to fashion clothing styles that embodied an indigenous tradition and culture. Cloth and clothing in fact became very important symbols of the national movement. A brief look at the 19th century changes will tell us a great deal about the transformations of the 20th century. When Western-style clothing came into India in the 19th century, Indians reacted in 3 different ways. 1. Many, especially men, began incorporating some elements of Western-style clothing in their dress. The wealthy Parsis of Western India were among the first to adapt Western-style clothing. Baggy trousers and the fenta, or hat, were added to long collarless coats, with boots and a walking stick to complete the look of the gentleman. To some, Western clothes were a sign of modernity and progress. Western-style clothing was also especially attractive to groups of Dalit converts to Christianity who now found it liberating. Here too, it was men rather than women who affected the new dress styles. 2. There were others who were convinced that Western culture would lead to a loss of traditional cultural identity. The use of Western-style clothes was taken as a sign of the world turning upside down. The cartoon of the Bengali Babu shown here mocks him for wearing Western-style boots and hat and coat along with his dhoti. 3. Some men resolved this dilemma by wearing Western clothes without giving up their Indian ones. Many Bengali bureaucrats in the late 19th century began stocking Western-style clothes for work outside the home and changed into more comfortable Indian clothes at home. Early 20th century anthropologist Very A. Elwin remembered that policemen in Pune who were going off duty would take their trousers off in the street and walk home in just tunic and undergarments. This difference between outer and inner worlds is still observed by some men today. Still others tried a slightly different solution to the same dilemma. They attempted to combine Western and Indian forms of dressing. These changes in clothing, however, had a turbulent history. 4.1 Caste conflict and dress change. Though there were no formal sumptuary laws as in Europe, India had its own strict social codes of food and dress. The caste system clearly defined what subordinate and dominant caste Hindus should wear, eat, etc., and these codes had the force of law. Changes in clothing styles that threatened these norms therefore often created violent social reactions. In May 1822, women of the Shinar caste were attacked by upper caste Nairs in public places in the southern princely state of Travancore, for wearing a cloth across their upper bodies. Over subsequent decades, a violent conflict over dress codes ensued. The Shinars, also called Natters, were a community of toddy tappers who migrated to southern Travancore to work under Nair landlords. As they were considered a subordinate caste, they were prohibited from using umbrellas and wearing shoes or golden ornaments. Men and women were also expected to follow the local custom of never covering their upper bodies before the upper castes. Under the influence of Christian missions, Shinar women converts began in the 1820s to wear tailored blouses and cloths to cover themselves like the upper castes. Soon Nairs, one of the upper castes of the region, attacked these women in public places and tore off their upper cloths. Complaints were also filed in court against this dress change, especially since Shinars were also refusing to render free labor for the upper castes. At first, the government of Travancore issued a proclamation in 1829 ordering Shinar women to abstain in future from covering the upper parts of the body. But this did not prevent Shinar Christian women, and even Shinar Hindus, from adopting the blouse and upper cloth. The abolition of slavery in Travancore in 1855 led to even more frustration among the upper castes who felt they were losing control. In October 1859, riots broke out as Shinar women were attacked in the marketplace and stripped of their upper cloths. Houses were looted and chapels burned. Finally, the government issued another proclamation permitting Shinar women, whether Christian or Hindu, to wear a jacket, or cover their upper bodies, in any manner whatever, but not like the women of high caste. 4.2 British rule and dress codes. How did the British react to Indian ways of dressing? How did Indians react to British attitudes? In different cultures, specific items of clothing often convey contrary meanings. This frequently leads to misunderstanding and conflict. Styles of clothing in British India changed through such conflicts. Consider the case of the turban and the hat. When European traders first began frequenting India, they were distinguished from the Indian turban wearers as the hat wearers. These two headgears not only looked different, they also signified different things. The turban in India was not just for protection from the heat but was a sign of respectability, and could not be removed at will. In the Western tradition, the hat had to be removed before social superiors as a sign of respect. This cultural difference created misunderstanding. The British were often offended if Indians did not take off their turban when they met colonial officials. Many Indians on the other hand wore the turban to consciously assert their regional or national identity. Another such conflict related to the wearing of shoes. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was customary for British officials to follow Indian etiquette and remove their footwear in the courts of ruling kings or chiefs. Some British officials also wore Indian clothes. But in 1830, Europeans were forbidden from wearing Indian clothes at official functions, so that the cultural identity of the white masters was not undermined. At the same time, Indians were expected to wear Indian clothes to office and follow Indian dress codes. In 1824-1828, Governor-General Amherst insisted that Indians take their shoes off as a sign of respect when they appeared before him, but this was not strictly followed. By the mid-19th century, when Lord Dalhousie was Governor-General, shoe respect was made stricter, and Indians were made to take off their shoes when entering any government institution. Only those who wore European clothes were exempted from this rule. Many Indian government servants were increasingly uncomfortable with these rules. In 1862, there was a famous case of defiance of the shoe respect rule in a Surat courtroom. Manakji Kawasji, an assessor in the Surat Fauzdari Adalat, refused to take off his shoes in the court of the sessions judge. The judge insisted that he take off his shoes as that was the Indian way of showing respect to superiors. But Manakji remained adamant. He was barred entry into the courtroom and he sent a letter of protest to the Governor of Bombay. The British insisted that since Indians took off their shoes when they entered a sacred place or home, they should do so when they entered the courtroom. In the controversy that followed, Indians urged that taking off shoes in sacred places and at home was linked to two different questions. 1. There was the problem of dirt and filth. Shoes collected the dirt on the road. This dirt could not be allowed into spaces that were clean, particularly when people in Indian homes sat on the ground. 2. Leather shoes and the filth that stuck under it were seen as polluting. But public buildings like the courtroom were different from home. But it took many years before shoes were permitted into the courtroom. 5. Designing the national dress. As nationalist feelings swept across India by the late 19th century, Indians began devising cultural symbols that would express the unity of the nation. Artists looked for a national style of art. Poets wrote national songs. Then a debate began over the design of the national flag. The search for a national dress was part of this move to define the cultural identity of the nation in symbolic ways. Self-conscious experiments with dress engaged men and women of the upper classes and castes in many parts of India. The Tagore family of Bengal experimented, beginning in the 1870s, with designs for a national dress for both men and women in India. Rabindranath Tagore suggested that instead of combining Indian and European dress, India's national dress should combine elements of Hindu and Muslim dress. Thus the chapkan, a long buttoned coat, was considered the most suitable dress for men. There were also attempts to develop a dress style that would draw on the tradition of different regions. In the late 1870s, Shnanadanandini Devi, wife of Satyendranath Tagore, the first Indian member of the ICS, returned from Bombay to Calcutta. She adopted the Parsi style of wearing the sari pinned to the left shoulder with a brooch, and worn with a blouse and shoes. This was quickly adopted by Brahmo Samaji women and came to be known as the Brahmika sari. This style gained acceptance before long among Maharashtrian and Uttar Pradesh Brahmos, as well as non-Brahmos. However, these attempts at devising a pan-Indian style did not fully succeed. Women of Gujarat, Kodagu, Kerala and Assam continue to wear different types of sari. 5.1 The Swadeshi movement. You have read about the Swadeshi movement in Bengal in the first decade of the 20th century. If you reflect back in the movement, you will realize that it was centrally linked to the politics of clothing. What was this politics? You know that the British first came to trade in Indian textiles that were in great demand all over the world. India accounted for 1/4 of the world's manufactured goods in the 17th century. There were 1 million weavers in Bengal alone in the middle of the 18th century. However, the Industrial Revolution in Britain, which mechanized spinning and weaving and greatly increased the demand for raw materials such as cotton and indigo, changed India's status in the world economy. Political control of India helped the British in two ways. Indian peasants could be forced to grow crops such as indigo, and cheap British manufacture easily replaced coarser Indian one. Large numbers of Indian weavers and spinners were left without work, and important textile weaving centers such as Murshidabad, Machilipatnam and Surat declined as demand fell. Yet by the middle of the 20th century, large numbers of people began boycotting British or mill-made cloth and adopting khadi, even though it was coarser, more expensive and difficult to obtain. How did this change come about? In 1905, Lord Curzon decided to partition Bengal to control the growing opposition to British rule. The Swadeshi movement developed in reaction to this measure. People were urged to boycott British goods of all kinds and start their own industries for the manufacture of goods such as matchboxes and cigarettes. Mass protests followed, with people vowing to cleanse themselves of colonial rule. The use of khadi was made a patriotic duty. Women were urged to throw away their silks and glass bangles and wear simple shell bangles. Rough homespun was glorified in songs and poems to popularize it. The change of dress appealed largely to the upper castes and classes rather than to those who had to make do with less and could not afford the new products. After 15 years, many among the upper classes also returned to wearing European dress. Though many people rallied to the cause of nationalism at this time, it was almost impossible to compete with cheap British goods that had flooded the market. Despite its limitations, the experiment with Swadeshi gave Mahatma Gandhi important ideas about using cloth as a symbolic weapon against British rule. 5.2 Mahatma Gandhi's experiments with clothing. The most familiar image of Mahatma Gandhi is of him seated, bare-chested and in a short dhoti, at the spinning wheel. He made spinning on the charkha and the daily use of khadi, or coarse cloth made from homespun yarn, very powerful symbols. These were not only symbols of self-reliance but also of resistance to the use of British mill-made cloth. Mahatma Gandhi's life and his experiments with clothing sum up the changing attitude to dress in the Indian subcontinent. As a boy from a Gujarati Banya family, he usually wore a shirt with a dhoti or pajama, and sometimes a coat. When he went to London to study law as a boy of 19 in 1888, he cut off the tuft on his head and dressed in a Western suit so that he would not be laughed at. On his return, he continued to wear Western suits, topped with a turban. As a lawyer in Johannesburg, South Africa in the 1890s, he still wore Western clothes. Soon he decided that dressing, unsuitably, was a more powerful political statement. In Durban in 1913, Gandhi first appeared in a lungi and kurta with his head shaved as a sign of mourning to protest against the shooting of Indian coal miners. On his return to India in 1915, he decided to dress like a Kathiawadi peasant. Only in 1921 did he adopt the short dhoti, the form of dress he wore until his death. On the 2nd of September 1921, a year after launching the non-cooperation movement, which sought Swaraj in 1 year, he announced, "I propose to discard at least up to 31st of October my topi and vest and to content myself with a loincloth, and a chador whenever necessary for protection of my body. I adopt the change because I have always hesitated to advise anything I may not be prepared to follow." At this time, he did not want to use this dress all his life and only wanted to experiment for a month or two. But soon he saw this as his duty to the poor, and he never wore any other dress. He consciously rejected the well-known clothes of the Indian ascetic and adopted the dress of the poorest Indian. Khadi, white and coarse, was to him a sign of purity, of simplicity, and of poverty. Wearing it became also a symbol of nationalism, a rejection of Western mill-made cloth. He wore the short dhoti without a shirt when he went to England for the Round Table Conference in 1931. He refused to compromise and wore it even before King George V at Buckingham Palace. When he was asked by journalists whether he was wearing enough clothes to go before the king, he joked that the king had enough on for both of yous. 5.3 Not all could wear khadi. Mahatma Gandhi's dream was to clothe the whole nation in khadi. He felt khadi would be a means of erasing difference between religions, classes, etc. But was it easy for others to follow in his footsteps? Was such a unity possible? Not many could take to the single peasant loincloth as he had. Nor did all want to. Here are some examples of other responses to Mahatma Gandhi's call. 1. Nationalists such as Motilal Nehru, a successful barrister from Allahabad, gave up his expensive Western-style suits and adopted the Indian dhoti and kurta. But these were not made of coarse cloth. 2. Those who had been deprived by caste norms for centuries were attracted to Western dress styles. Therefore, unlike Mahatma Gandhi, other nationalists such as Babasaheb Ambedkar never gave up the Western-style suit. Many Dalits began in the early 1910s to wear three-piece suits, and shoes and socks on all public occasions, as a political statement of self-respect. 3. A woman who wrote to Mahatma Gandhi from Maharashtra in 1928 said, "A year ago, I heard you speaking on the extreme necessity of every one of us wearing khadi and thereupon decided to adopt it. But we are poor people, my husband says khadi is costly. Belonging as I do to Maharashtra, I wear a sari 9 yards long, and the elders will not hear of a reduction to 6 yards." 4. Other women, like Sarojini Naidu and Kamala Nehru, wore colored saris with designs, instead of coarse, white homespun. Conclusion. Changes in styles of clothing are thus linked up with shifts in cultural tastes and notions of beauty, with changes within the economy and society, and with issues of social and political conflict. So when we see clothing styles alter, we need to ask, why do these changes take place? What do they tell us about society and its history? What can they tell us about changes in tastes and technologies, markets and industries? New words. Cockade, cap, usually worn on one side. Ermine, type of fur. Chintz, cotton cloth printed with designs and flowers. From the Hindi word chint. Stays, support as part of a woman's dress to hold the body straight. Corset, a closely fitting and stiff inner bodice, worn by women to give shape and support to the figure. Suffrage, the right to vote. The suffragettes wanted the right for women to vote. Busk, a strip of wood, whalebone or steel in front of the corset to stiffen and support it. Pabulum, anything essential to maintain life and growth. Source A. Mary Somerville, one of the first woman mathematicians, describes in her memoirs the experience of her childhood days. Although perfectly straight and well-made, I was encased in stiff stays, with a steel busk in front, while above my frock, bands drew my shoulder back until the shoulder blades met. Then a steel rod with a semicircle, which went under my chin, was clasped to the steel busk in my stays. In this constrained state, I and most of the younger girls had to prepare our lessons. From Martha Somerville, ed. Personal Recollections from Early Life to Old Age of Mary Somerville, London 1873. Source B. Many government officials of the time were alarmed at the health implications of the prevailing styles of dressing amongst women. Consider the following attack on the corset. It is evident physiologically that air is the pabulum of life, and that the effect of a tight cord round the neck and of tight lacing differ only in degrees, for the strangulations are both fatal. To wear tight stays in many cases is to wither, to waste, to die. The Registrar General in the 9th Annual Report of 1857. Source C. Do you know how the famous English poet John Keats (1795–1821) described his ideal woman? He said she was like a milk-white lamb that bleats for man's protection. In his novel Vanity Fair, 1848, Thackeray described the charm of a woman character, Amelia, in these words. I think it was her weakness which was her principal charm, a kind of sweet submission and softness, which seemed to appeal to each man she met, for his sympathy and protection. Source D. When asked to take off his shoes at the Surat Fauzdari Adalat at Surat in 1862, Meenakshi told the judge that he was willing to take off even his turban but not his shoes. He said, taking off my pugri would have been a greater insult to myself than to the court, but I would have submitted to it, because there is nothing of conscience, or religion involved in it. I hold no respect or disrespect, embodied or disembodied in the shoes, but the putting on of our turban is the greatest of all respects that we pay. We do not have our pugris on when at home, but when we go out to see respectable persons we are bound by social etiquette to have it on, whilst we Parsis, in our social intercourse, never ever take off our shoes before any Parsi however great. Source E. Some people supported the attempt to change women's clothing, others opposed it. Any civilized nation is against the kind of clothing in use in the present time among women of our country. Indeed, it is a sign of shamelessness. Educated men have been greatly agitated about it. Almost everyone wishes for another kind of civilized clothing. There is a custom here of women wearing fine and transparent clothing which reveals the whole body. Such shameless attire in no way allows one to frequent civilized company. Such clothes can stand in the way of our moral improvement. Saudamini Kastagiri, Strelokar Perichad, 1872. Source F. C. Kesavan's autobiography Jivita Samaram recalls his mother-in-law's first encounter with a blouse gifted by her sister-in-law in the late 19th century. It looked good, but I felt ticklish wearing it. I took it off, folded it carefully and brimming with enthusiasm, showed it to my mother. She gave me a stern look and said, "Where are you going to gallivant in this? Fold it and keep it in the box." I was scared of my mother. She could kill me. At night I wore the blouse and showed it to my husband. He said it looked good. The next morning, I came out wearing the blouse. I didn't notice my mother coming. Suddenly I heard her break a piece from a coconut branch. When I turned round, she was behind me, fierce and furious. She said, "Take it off, you want to walk around in shirts like Muslim women." Box 1. Not all sumptuary laws were meant to emphasize social hierarchy. Some sumptuary laws were passed to protect home production against imports. For instance, in 16th century England, velvet caps made with material imported from France and Italy were popular amongst men. England passed a law which compelled all persons over 6 years of age, except those of high position, to wear woolen caps made in England, on Sundays and all holy days. This law remained in effect for 26 years and was very useful in building up the English woolen industry. Box 2. The movement for rational dress reform. Mrs. Amelia Bloomer, an American, was the first dress reformer to launch loose tunics worn over ankle-length trousers. The trousers were known as bloomers, rationals, or knickerbockers. The Rational Dress Society was started in England in 1881, but did not achieve significant results. It was the First World War that brought about radical changes in women's clothing. Box 3. The turban on the head. The Mysore turban, called pita, was edged with gold lace, and adopted as part of the Durbar dress of the Mysore court in the mid-19th century. By the end of the 19th century, a wide variety of officials, teachers and artists in Mysore began wearing the turban, sometimes with the western suit, as a sign of belonging to the princely state. Today, the Mysore turban is used largely on ceremonial occasions and to honor visiting dignitaries. Box 4. The Gandhi cap. Sometime after his return to India from South Africa in 1915, Mahatma Gandhi transformed the Kashmiri cap that he sometimes used into a cheap white cotton khadi cap. For 2 years from 1919, he himself wore the cap, and then gave it up, but by this time it had become part of the nationalist uniform and even a symbol of defiance. For example, the Gwalior state tried to prohibit its use in 1921 during the non-cooperation movement. During the Khilafat movement, the cap was worn by large numbers of Hindus and Muslims. A group of Santals who attacked the police in 1922 in Bengal demanding the release of Santhal prisoners believed that the Gandhi cap would protect them from bullets. 3 of them died as a result. Large numbers of nationalists defiantly wore the Gandhi cap and were even beaten or arrested for doing so. With the rise of the Khilafat movement in the post-First World War years, the fez, a tasseled Turkish cap, became a sign of anti-colonialism in India. Though many Hindus, as in Hyderabad for instance, also wore the fez, it soon became identified solely with Muslims.